Brazil are the only country to qualify for every single World Cup in history. All 22 iterations they've been there for, and they did so using their famous, creative Brazilian samba style of football, the flair, the dribbling, the undeniable dominance. I mean, they are the most decorated country in the history of the sport, and you can't even talk about the history of football without mentioning names like Leonidas da Silva, Pele, Garrincha, Ronaldo Nazario, Ronaldinho, Antony. Things are really starting to look ugly for this national team. You see, the way that World Cup qualifying works down in South America, since there are only 10 countries, if you exclude like Guyana and Suriname, they don't count. But every team gets 18 matches because they get a home and away against every other country. And if you finish top 4, you go to the World Cup. If you finish 5th, you get a World Cup playoff against another confederation, which a lot of times the CONMEBOL team would win because there's a lot of good football in South America, but it's not guaranteed. And if you finished on the bottom half of the table, you just simply didn't go to the World Cup. For reference, in the 2022 World Cup qualifiers, Brazil went undefeated. They won 14 games, they drew 3 matches, and then they decided they weren't even going to play the last game against Argentina, which was going to get rescheduled, but never did because there was no doubt that either of those countries was going to the World Cup. So they didn't even play their 18th match. But this World Cup qualifying is very different because on match day 3, they drew at home against Venezuela, a country who's never been to the World Cup, a country who finished dead last in qualifiers last time around. And then on match day 4, they went on to lose to Uruguay. On match day 5, Brazil went on to lose to Colombia. And then on match day 6, they lost their first ever World Cup qualifier game at home. They had never, ever lost in Brazil in a World Cup qualifier until this year. And then on match day 7, it seemed like they were turning things around with a win against Ecuador, but then on match day 8, they lost to Paraguay. This is unprecedented territory for a juggernaut nation you'd never expect to be in this kind of situation. A situation that leaves them 1 point separated from Bolivia, who are in 8th place in qualifiers. That's how close Brazil are to not making it to the World Cup. But this issue didn't just start for the Brazil national team this year, or even in World Cup qualifying. In fact, it can be tracked back a couple of decades. 1958 was the first time that Brazil had ever won a World Cup. It surprisingly took them 6 tries to get it done, even back when the format didn't have as many teams. And a lot of the reason for that was because this game was a rich man's game. It wasn't exactly for the working class. The clubs in Brazil weren't signing working class players, and the famous roster for Brazil wasn't signing them to the national team either. But it didn't stop the growth of football in Brazil because street football took on a new form and it developed a style known as the famous samba football. These players were some of the best in the world, let alone Brazil, but they weren't really getting the same opportunities as the other players until the 1940s and the 1950s. And that's when Brazil really began to develop as one of the most powerful nations when it comes to football. There were so many good players on this roster, and all of them played for clubs in Brazil. You had the likes of Pele, Didi, Garrincha. Only 3 players on this 1958 roster even played abroad, and in 1962, only 2 players played outside of Brazil. This national team had its own identity and really defined the beautiful game. The European leagues at this time were already undergoing a renaissance of structure, tactics, and formation, and all of the players that played in Europe are used to this kind of style. But when they came up against Brazil in these tournaments, their creativity in the final third was unlike anything they had ever seen before, and they didn't know how to defend it, which is why Brazil went to win the 1958, 1962, and the 1970 World Cup. 3 out of the next 4 World Cups were taken by Brazil. This is no coincidence. They had some of the best players in the world, but they also knew how to play with each other. But things started to change after the 1970 World Cup because the European game started to take over. The money wasn't in Sao Paulo. The money was in Manchester, in Barcelona, in Madrid, and so the best players started to go abroad. After Pele won his 3rd World Cup in 1970, Brazil went a long 24 years without winning another World Cup, and by 1994, it was quite a new dynamic for the team because instead of just 2 or 3 players playing abroad, now 60% or more of the roster was playing in Europe. And by 2002, the most stacked Brazilian squad of all time with the likes of R9, Ronaldinho, Rivaldo, a young Kaká, this team had everything they needed to win, and they did, but only one of the players in the starting 11 was from the Brazilian league, and that was the goalkeeper, and he didn't even always start either, because Dida from AC Milan also got a lot of minutes at that goalkeeper spot. Most the entire team, if not the entire team, was now playing at clubs in Europe. Despite the occasional flair and incredibly infectious smile of Ronaldinho, this team was far more rigid, tactical, and less creative than the Brazilian teams of the past. And despite the fans of Brazil being happy that they were bringing home a 5th and record-breaking World Cup in 2002, they were still critical of the team and their style of play, saying that they were quickly killing their own identity and that samba football was dying. Though it's hard to be upset when your country is bringing home the most prestigious award in football, the World Cup. But what happens when you lose your identity but also aren't bringing results home? Well, let's ask the Brazil fans now, because in 2006, they got knocked out of the quarterfinal. In 2010, they got knocked out of the quarterfinal. And in 2014, they suffered what may be the most embarrassing loss in the history of football, a 7-1 loss to Germany, who admittedly took their foot off the pedal because Brazil were playing at home. That was the low point in Brazilian football, or at least we thought so. Because in the last decade, the failures of the Brazilian national team continue, stooping even lower than that fateful day against Germany. They've been overshadowed by Chile in the mid-2010s and most recently by Argentina's dominance. They've only won 1 out of the last 6 Copa America despite hosting it twice and being the favorites to win the tournament in 5 of them. But in 2024, things changed and they weren't the favorite anymore. It got so bad, in fact, in the preseason leading up to the CONMEBOL Copa America in 2024, they ended up drawing against a poor form United States, and Ronaldinho came out and said it's difficult to find energy to watch the games. This is maybe one of the worst teams in recent years. It has no respectable leaders, just average players for the most part. I've been following football since I was a kid, long before I thought about becoming a player, and I've never seen a situation as bad as this. There's a lack of love for the shirt, a lack of determination, and most importantly, a lack of football. This is one of the worst things I've ever seen. It's a shame. That's why I declare I'm giving up here. I won't watch any CONMEBOL Copa America games, and I won't celebrate if Brazil win. Now, Ronaldinho did retract that final statement, and he did say that he's still going to support Brazil, and he's still going to celebrate if they did end up winning, which they didn't. But I still think there's a lot of truth to the statement that he put out, especially in the words before that. And that brings us back to today, where Brazil are struggling to qualify for the World Cup in 2026. And they should be thanking FIFA, who are generously expanding the World Cup to 48. And it's totally not a money grab idea, but it does allow for 6 out of the 10 CONMEBOL teams to automatically go to the World Cup, and the 7th place team gets an intercontinental playoff. But even then, Brazil sit 1 point out of not even making that playoff. This is a disaster, and they've gone from having the greatest team in the world with the most beautiful style of play to not having the most beautiful style of play and not having the best team either. The Brazilian situation is a disaster. And now there's only one man that can save this national team. Dorival Jr., give him the call up. That's it for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Nitro Football, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.